Welcome, one and all, to this episode of the Bionicle Inspiration Series 2019 Bio Cup coverage. The preliminary round, of course, has come to an end, so we're going to do one more episode covering everything that was entered in the contest, and then after that, we're going to do an extra special bonus recap thingamajig, which you'll be seeing very, very soon this week. Which will just be covering a few. You'll have to wait and see. I'll talk about the winners. I'll talk about what's coming next for the next round. Which all of that you can currently see on the Flickr group. But I'm gonna put it in an even cooler way. It'll make you excited and it'll be a fun and great time. So stay tuned for that. But what do we want in this episode, where we're going to talk about 8 entries into the preliminary round? And you might be like, oh, my one wasn't in this episode. Don't you worry your little pants off, because the next episode I'm going to talk about a lot of them. So, you wait, Jimmy. You're going to get your thing in, most likely. So what was the preliminary round all about? Well, I've invited my good friend Palpatine to tell us exactly what the preliminary round was all about, so that, we know what we're looking at today.
For the preliminary round, you're being asked to build something frightening, ghoulish, macabre, or just plain icky. Build something that sends shivers down the spine, and as you're checking under your bed at night. Anything goes. A Makuta, a creepy crawly, or your biggest fear. Or you can take a more creative approach to the theme.
So that's what we'll be talking about today. Let's begin. The first mock that we've got in this awesome episode is by James Zahn and is called The Nightmare Amalgam-Z. So I really, really love the big old, massive, scary mouth design that this guy's got. It's very system heavy, but I think that's what makes it so cool. He's able to pack in all the little different teeth everywhere, which is just a little bit too difficult to do with Bionicle, I would imagine, or it's just a bit easier to shape and make it look a little bit more kind of, nautical or kind of shark-like to some degree. There's little nods to that a little bit. Obviously, it's not directly like a shark, but a few things there. At least that's the way I'm looking at it, and I really like that. And I think that's what makes this mock so cool, in my opinion, is the fact that it really stands out. It has this unique mouth that's so large and out there, and just the way that it's kind of stretched out to the sides like that and everything. It's just so unique looking and so interesting. And I think that's always something to go for when you're entering into the Bio Cup or any competition, or just if you want to just build a cool looking mock, is to really kind of stretch the limits on what you can do, or do something in ways that it's not really been done before, that you just don't see people do in building. It might be something that you see all the time in like horror movies or video game design, but people just don't do it in Lego. So you go, oh, I'm going to do it. Why not? And that's kind of the thing too. This entire mock, I want to talk about the arm design on this guy. It's pretty cool, using those Gresh blades like that as these sort of almost kind of praying mantis style arms. They're very fitting and very cool looking. But kind of the general premise of this mock is, it's that thing of how can you take a very typical human frame or shape and then stretch it to its limits. So take the mouth and make it massively long and add heaps of teeth onto it, or take the arms and instead of actually giving him hands or fingers or anything, he just has blades and they're sort of shaped a bit differently. Or you take the leg and you make it look digigrade like that, and it has this unique shape to it and stuff like that. And I feel like more or less that's kind of how they do your typical characters from a TV show or a movie or something. The horror scary monsters and stuff. It's that thing of how can we make the scary guy look very unhuman, because that's essentially what a monster is, right? It's something that is far from the norm, or something that's far from your typical human character, or far from yourself, so much so that makes it scarier. The fact that a monster has thousands upon hundreds of teeth is scary because humans don't have that. Or the fact that it has blades coming out of its hands, one, is scary because humans don't have that, but also they're blades and they'll kill you, and that's a bad time. So, it just helps to make a scary, frightening monster, which is, of course, what this round is all about. And so that's something you yourself could think about. Maybe you're making something. Well, obviously you can't now that the preliminary round's over, but maybe you really like this concept of building some scary monsters and you want to try your own hand at it, or it's just the thing you're working on right now really fits that aesthetic. So you're like, you know what? No, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna see what aspects of the mock I can really kind of drag out. Like maybe I want to, instead of just giving him a typical like hand design, maybe I really try and accentuate long claws to show off this sort of evil look that he's got. Could work really well. So there's something to consider. So really nice work there, James. Love what you've done. Let's move on to the next mock, which is by Corn Builder and is Skin and Bone. Now, in my notes about this that I wanted to talk about in this episode, I simply wrote, "Oh, FlexTube, thou art a beautiful thing," because It is such a very, very helpful, beautiful piece. And of course, that is how this mouth design has been made here. You know, we see a bunch of these red Technic pieces here, which I don't even know what those are called, but they're great pieces. You can kind of see some more of them in there on the mouth as well. But he's just used a bunch of those, but attached them on the flex tube. And then so, since it's a flex tube and it's flexible, you're able to kind of get that cool angle with it to get that semicircle shape, which very naturally forms the sort of gum mouth design here, which is fantastic. And it's that thing, you look at a lot of different mocks out there from some very talented builders. You would have seen a bunch of them on the show, or just, you know, you might follow them on Instagram or Flickr or something. A lot of really, really talented people like to use flex tube because you can achieve such interesting angles and things with it. You know, it might be a little bit harder to get this semicircle shape with your typical ordinary pieces, but when you do it with flex tube here, you can get interesting angles, you can have it at a curve, you can flip it around and do all sorts of craziness with it. So it's such a really versatile, helpful piece to have, honestly. Like we see here on this mock, he's been able to achieve this fantastic gum design that perfectly illustrates this almost, yeah, I mean, the mock is called Skin and Bone. You know, this looks like this sort of skeletal head, but it still has skin on it, but it still has so many kind of skull-like qualities to it. It's very abject, like I was talking about in some of the past episodes of the BioCup coverage here. It's fantastic. And I love that, you know, and the beautiful shaping he's achieved with this, with these various different tan pieces here, all sort of Hero Factory parts, as well as a few system pieces and things here and there, and even this big old dish at the top here to really sort of tie everything together. It's beautiful. The sort of not too gappy design, except for around where the nose is, but that's kind of perfect. You know, it makes sense that there would be a hole there, especially because if this is kind of a skull, there basically is just a hole there. It's fantastic to see. I think that's where this mock really pops, is in the teeth design and also just in how compact everything is and how well all these parts flow into each other. And then another thing I love is this eye design here. It looks like it's just a bunch of different tires sort of put in together to form this sort of very, you know, a bunch of repeated circles here to get this eye shape. And then I imagine that is a 1x1 round stud tile piece. And then maybe that's like an Exoforce ratchet joint that's actually connected into, and the tires are just put onto that. Something like that to kind of create that eye. But just that repeated thing of just adding a bunch of tires and putting them into each other like that, it looks really cool and it works really well. So that's awesome to see. And really creates a very popping, awesome looking eye design, which is fantastic. So yeah, quite fitting for the theme, just in terms of it does have that sort of slight scariness to it, but it also looks quite natural, but not quite. It's awesome. I think it's a nice play on the theme here. Very cool. Let's move on to the next mock. It's by Zio's Workshop and is called Spooky Scary SKELECLOWN. And that's exactly what this is. This is a spooky, scary SKELECLOWN, because clowns, they're scary, man. And I really love what he's done with the head design here, this very sort of system-heavy head design that, you know, has these claws where the mouth should be, but also using these 2x2 system pieces here, these 2x2 round bricks that have that sort of almost kind of pillar texture to them. It's very fitting for clown hair. It's actually, I think, quite a nice piece used there, and a really decent texture to use for that sort of hair that you would typically see on a clown, which is awesome. And I love this little tiny addition here of this flower just on the side there. I think it's a perfect little thing that actually does a lot for the mock, in my opinion, and adds a bit of character to it, which is great. And overall, the kind of lanky design that this guy's got, you know, specifically on the arms and stuff, I think is very fitting and really kind of helps to communicate this sort of very kind of evil shadow demon kind of look that he's got. And it does help to make it look a little bit more scary, especially with his rib cage and a few other things. But also another thing that helps make things a bit scary is this asymmetrical design here. You know, it's that thing of, you know, when you have an asymmetrical design, both sides are different. Whereas if you had that kind of uniformity of, you know, both his legs look exactly the same, both his arms look the same, that sort of thing, you know, the uniformity kind of lends itself to order and things being in the right place, everything being okay, but asymmetry can lead itself to chaos and things not quite being right, which again kind of subtly lends itself to being quite fitting for this scary monster vibe, because, yeah, something's not quite right, and I think asymmetry is the perfect thing to do for that, because just naturally how that works and the language that communicates actually says a lot for your mock and helps to communicate so much. It's a clever thing to do. So yeah, nice work there on your spooky, scary skeleton. Some great stuff going on. Let's move on to the next mock, which is by Triple Number C and is called Midnight Howl. I certainly think one thing that a lot of AFOLs do, and TFOLs in the Bionicle community, is now it's quite a more modern sort of building technique, or sort of style, I guess, less of a technique. But people really like to take pieces and find interesting ways of making it into a head design, or finding some way that a couple pieces can form a really interesting mouth design or something. And I think this mock is a good example of that. You know, you see a whole bunch of it on stuff like Joxon's mocks and a whole bunch of other things that I've covered on BIS in the past. But yeah, here's another example of it. So, taking this funky scully kind of bone claw ribcage kind of piece that came on some Bionicle G2 sets, and then combining that with the fangs mask that came in Hero Factory 3.0, it does form this sort of interesting, sort of almost skeletal skull-like design for this mock, and then this interesting mouth that it has below, and sort of flipping that fangs piece upside down like that does form a very different look to that mouth that was already present on that specific piece. And it's cool, just the way those two pieces flow so nicely into each other. It almost looks like one whole piece. And yeah, beautiful sort of flow between the two parts like that. And it just looks fantastic. And then also too, getting those eyes in there, really piercing, little tiny eyes, but just the beautiful contrast of this pop of, I can't tell if that's orange or red, but this beautiful pop of another color being introduced there on an otherwise basically entirely silver, black, gunmetal mark. Just very dark colors, and then suddenly this pop of a lighter color does a lot for the mark, and does create these sort of sinister, scarier eyes, which again helps with the look. So really nice color play that he's done there. I really, really like that. And some, beautiful shaping on the head. Also really like the foot design here, using these batwing pieces that came on some of the Shadow Avmatorin simply just as the feet. It's a very simple design, but I think it works well, and it very much ties in with the hands on this Mark II, the specific clawed look that has, because you take a look at the arms and they do sort of have this three claw look to them that just the general shape kind of naturally resembles the kind of rough look of those bat wings as well. So even though the parts themselves are a little bit different and the textures are very different as well, there is this sort of familiarity to the design there, and the general look seems very similar. So it's quite fitting and quite cool to see. I really like it. Also really love just the lanky big limbs that he's got here, and especially how they're posed in this photo where they're just kind of all over the place. Like, it kind of makes him seem scary, like this guy's out of control and stuff like that. Posing can do so much to communicate something with your mock, and this is a cool example of that. So nice work, Triple Number C. Let's move on to the next mock, and this is a mock by Keke, and is called Lego Beldam. Now, this is a reference to a very beloved book/movie of mine, which is Coraline by Neil Gaiman, and it is awesome to see that, taking some pretty heavy inspiration from that, and a really, really awesome aesthetic that this mock has managed to achieve. So I love the perfect little kind of button eyes that he's got here, very piercing, using those the studs with the holes in them, but then attaching what appears to be, I think it's, I actually don't quite know what it is, but the look of it almost looks sort of trans clear or grey. It might be some of the trans clear like tubing that we have that also has like a little bit of blue or lime in it, but I can't quite tell from these pictures. But, regardless, just that the simple addition of that specific stud and then putting something in it really does create this very piercing eye design to it, and, especially with the button eye thing that you typically see in Coraline. I think that's very fitting and very clever, and I love it. And I also love, too, the limbs on this guy. The fact that they are so thin, but very, very long at the same time, and it's such an interesting aesthetic. Because, well, one, it's the interesting thing that, the hands are simply holding themselves up, but these legs, they're not actually holding the mock up, at least if I'm seeing this correctly. It appears that what is actually holding this mock up is all underneath these cloak pieces here, and so there's obviously something that's, some sort of lattice that's holding up the rest of the mock. And these additional legs here are just for show. Obviously it looks like it's holding the mock up, but it is in fact not structurally. And I love that. Can you do that on your mock? Can you kind of cheat things in some fashion so that, typically that doesn't work in terms of things holding themselves up or proportion or blah, 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 or just general strength on the mock or whatever. But you cheat it in some fashion so that it appears that it's doing so. That's always, a cool thing to do, and something that if you play your cards right, you can really use to your advantage. But specifically having these exceedingly thin limbs that are also quite long and stuff and kind of overbearing. It's such a beautiful kind of character design, but it also is very reminiscent of the movie Coraline, but also very reminiscent of kind of like Tim Burton style character design. They tend to have those very thin limbs, but very naturally kind of scarier looking characters. And I think this mock actually captures that very nicely. Yeah, it's beautiful. Some really, really nice stuff going on here. And I also really specifically love all the capes here too, kind of being either it could look like sort of a dress of some kind, which I believe is the inspiration here, but it also could just sort of be this sort of flowing shadow that's sort of oozing out of the character here. And I think both interpretations are really fitting and really cool. So I quite like that. Let's move on to the next mock, which is by Matter Turbo and is called Mr. Itch. So I love this guy. He's so adorable. Just, his big old fangs there and this big sort of rough and tough demon guy. But then he's got some flowers. It's like he's knocking on the door and he's like, "Oh, hey, Mr. Jim, I'm here to, take your girl out for a nice dinner date. But don't worry, I'll have her home by 9 o'clock. Don't you worry." Like, he seems like a nice little gentleman. He seems very, very, sensitive and emotional. He's got these flowers, He seems like a nice guy, but, he is this scary, one-eyed demon man with big old, like, tusk fangs coming out of his mouth there. I love the contrast between the two because I think this is perfectly fitting for the scary monsters thing because he is a scary monster. But what an interesting addition of just simply adding those flowers and it actually saying so much about the mock because it's like, well, why has he got those? He is this scary guy, but there's another quality to him as well. Isn't that interesting? Yeah, I really, really like that. I think that's some beautiful character exploration and really effective communication of character. And it's such a simple little addition that's been able to do that, just simply giving him some flowers to hold. And I think that does a lot for this, and I love it. I also really love the eye design here. It's just simply adding that Lord of the Rings ring onto the stud there. Kind of gives it this interesting kind of pupil look to it, which I think looks really interesting and really cool, and I love it. And yeah, I was talking before about the sort of additional teeth there, having those Visorak, well, yeah, also Borok eyes or Visorak eyes there in white as sort of larger fangs, but then he's got those smaller fangs there around the rest of his mouth. And I like that, having slightly larger fangs and also just his typical teeth is just a cool design and very much works here. And again, I think communicates a lot about this character, makes him look really gruff and tough and monstrous, but, he's got a soft heart inside. I like that. Very, very cool. Let's now move on to the second last mock, which is by Dan Cross and is called The Flayed. I think it's a great idea to use some of these cricket pieces on a sort of scary monster here because naturally the look of all of these pieces is such a, I don't know, they have this sort of bone-like quality to them and there's something sinister about them, especially because they came on a Makuta character, which, naturally that is the look that Makuta have. So very fitting to pick pieces from sets that already had that look to them because it's, a lot of those qualities can be transferred onto your mock because, well, that's how those pieces were more or less designed to look. But also the color scheme of those pieces is so fitting too because they have this bone-like quality to them, which, yeah, that alone can be scary because bones and skeletons is, more associated with things that are a bit more scarier. But this marbled red through the milky white here kind of also looks a bit like blood, and once again, very fitting for a spooky, scary monster guy. And then additionally combining them with these Pridak pieces here, specifically that headpiece, which has also got that beautiful white and red marble throughout it. Not so much the milky aspect to it, but it still has that. It's so fitting and so cool to see. Those pieces seem to complement each other very nicely, which is awesome. And yeah, both of them kind of communicate this sort of blood skeletal look to them, which I love. And another thing I love too is these tubes and things flowing up along the torso and then into the head that kind of resembles like bodily guts and intestines and scary, creepy, gross things. I like that. Such an interesting look to it, and using only kind of one or two pieces, and those pieces themselves are naturally a lot longer, so you don't even need to use a whole bunch of them. You can really just use, I imagine there's maybe about 3 or 4 of them in there. There's not too many. It might even be that they're sort of wrapped around a couple times there or something, but it's a little hard to tell. But really, really cool and very effectively conveying that sort of intestine gut-like look to it, which is awesome. I also love the posing this guy's in, just how his hands are kind of rubbing together like he's plotting some evil scheme. Really, really cool posing that's communicating a lot of character. Very nice. I also just noticed too how those arms are connected, the way that they just sort of slot in nicely to these Kina blade pieces which form the bulk of the upper arm. That's so perfect and so cool looking. I love that. Really great way of creating an upper arm there. Very nice. So nice work, Dan Cross. Let's move on to the final mock in this episode, which is by Tino Pautanen and is called Ancient Earthworm. So really, really like this guy. I love the general sort of face design on this mock using these 2 Humungosaur arm pieces from the good old Ben 10 Bionicle CCBS sets. Not really Bionicle, just CCBS sets, but they were great. I've said that countless times. Those sets have brilliant pieces in them, and this is a great example of how effectively you can use those parts, because Who'd have thought that those would have formed such a beautiful looking dinosaur head like this? And then kind of combining it with these red system pieces to kind of form this tongue and just sort of the, the inside of the mouth there. So fitting, and I can just already hear the roar that this guy's making. It's so fitting and so cool. I also love all this kind of spikes and other kind of appendages on this guy, whether it's on the back or kind of along the chin there. They just have these unique shapes to them, which, and even just kind of the way they're attached, it almost kind of looks like something's growing out of him, or he just has, they're not spikes in a typical way. They have these very unique flowing shapes to them, and I don't know, it kind of gives him this sort of very interesting alien or kind of prehistoric look, and I really like that. Especially the placement around the chin there kind of reminds me of Admiral Akbar, how he kind of has those sort of, not quite whiskers, but he does have that on his chin, especially in the Last Jedi and the Force Awakens there. Very, very cool to see on this mock, and very fitting, and yeah, I don't know, just a very unique way of doing spikes or claws or whatever you want to call it on a mock that's, just really cool to see. And also love the general kind of segmentation of the design here, using a bunch of system pieces, but you can kind of see from the transition from the head to the sort of neck and then into the back and general body here. It's sort of 3 definite segments, and there's obviously posable bits connecting each of those, so that this mock has a lot of posability, but kind of does look like it flows into each other, but the way that it's designed has been in those 3 set segments like that, which is really cool to see. Kind of a little bit reminiscent of the really, really awesome brand new Jurassic Park set we're getting with the big old dinosaur. The general look of that is in sort of segments so that it can pose very nicely. Really, really cool to see, and a great way of approaching a mock similar to this. So that's been a bunch of entries into the BioCup preliminary round. Like I said at the start of the episode, stay tuned for the last episode that we will have, which will be covering the preliminary round, and then we'll move on into round 1. If you entered and you still haven't checked the Flickr group, be sure to, because the winners of the preliminary round and who's moving on into round 1 and what round 1 is all about is all over there. I won't be saying what that is here, so be sure to check it out. But if you're like, I don't want to read the Flickr group, I just want to watch your content, Ben. Don't worry, because literally I'm recording this episode today, and I'm going to post it today, and then the following day I'm going to pretty much spend all of tomorrow recording this fun little coverage video, which is going to kind of cover a whole bunch of the preliminary round, and then sort of have a little bit of speculation about what we're expecting out of round 1 of the BioCup. So stay tuned for that. It's going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to be a really nice way of concluding our coverage of the preliminary round and heading into round 1. So get ready and get hyped. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next episode of the BioCup 2019 Bionicle Inspiration Series coverage. See you then. Happy building. Bye for now.